talk about how you can find and use historical hospital records for genealogy research. A lot of these resources I'm going to cover can be accessed for free, which is always a plus, and I'll leave the links for them in the description below. From physicians' medical records to asylum casebooks, these records contain all kinds of information that might help fill in the gaps or simply shed more light on the life of your ancestor. There's definitely potential to uncover some fascinating details here. Now, I originally mentioned hospital records in an earlier video as one of many other potential death records, but later in the video, I'll also discuss other types of hospital records outside of those so you can get a better idea of what else could be available. Over the years, obtaining hospital records has been a challenging research task to take on, considering the confidential nature of the records and evolving privacy laws, particularly in places like the United States, where laws like HIPAA, also known as Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, exist, which was passed in 1996 and regulates electronic access to medical records. At the time, limiting that access to the patient only, unless written permission was given from the patient and extended to another individual. Upon the death of the patient, those records would then be sealed forever. So unless you had legal permission granted to you, you would not be accessing those records ever. Luckily for genealogists, laws do change, and in this case, HIPAA was later revised in 2013 to limit the period of protection from forever to 50 years after the patient died. So privacy restrictions will depend on the local laws where the records are being kept, but you'll typically see that right now access is generally restricted to anywhere from 50 to 100 years from the creation of the record. Now that number could be bigger, it could be smaller. It just depends on the institution holding the records and the laws that govern it. This is why you'll need to determine the accessibility of the records on a case-by-case basis, starting by researching the hospital in question along with its history. Which is why the first thing that you'll need is some historical context behind the hospital that you're researching. You might already know the name of the hospital that you want to research, or maybe you're still searching for that. Maybe there's family lore that you had an ancestor who spent time in an asylum, and that's all you have to go off of, in which case you'll need to search the area that your ancestor lived for asylums that existed nearby during their lifetime. Or maybe you already have the name of the hospital from the death certificate, a census schedule, court records, an obituary, or even cemetery and mortuary records. Once you know the name of the hospital, start researching its history. Having knowledge of the hospital's background gives you a better understanding of your ancestors' time and experience there, but the most important information that you'll want to extract is where the hospital was located, so you can then track down where the historical records were sent for safekeeping. You'll find that some hospitals have closed, merged, changed names, possibly even moved locations over the years. Even if the hospital is still in business, contacting hospitals directly to access their old records isn't the best avenue because modern hospitals only hold their records for a specified length of time. Which brings us to the next step. Once you've identified the name of the hospital and where it was located, it's time to determine where these historical hospital records are kept today. You'll find a lot of them have been acquired by the local library, the state archive, or local historical society. And many of these collections are now accessible to the public, whether digitally online or in person. Again, depending on the laws that govern the institution that's the custodian of the records, you might have to fill out an application to access the records, or it's possible that you'll need to request a staff lookup, where they'll access the records on your behalf and provide redacted copies to protect the privacy of other patients' data, especially if it details a medical condition that may have been passed down to a patient's living ancestors. To determine where the records are held for a specific hospital, start by visiting the websites for each of these organizations, so the local library, the state archive, or the local historical society based on the location of the hospital, and search their available record collections. You could also inquire by email or phone. Often these institutions can at least steer you in the right direction if it turns out that they don't hold the hospital records that you're searching for. This, of course, is just one way to locate historical hospital records. There's a growing online database of digitized hospital records as well, and you can access many of those for free. That being said, here are some genealogy websites with digitized hospital records. The Digital Public Library of America currently has over 11,000 results when you search hospital records in their database. So you'll likely want to be a little more specific with your search, or you can filter the search results over here on the left by location, language, collection, etc. Of course, if you know the name of the hospital, you would just type that in to see what comes up. So if you were searching for Mays Confederate Hospital, then this set of digitized records would pop up as a relevant item. If we click on that, we'll see that these records were created between 1864 and 1865, and that Mays Confederate Hospital was located near Madison in Morgan County, Georgia, before it was burned down by General William Sherman on his march to the sea in 1864. The first section of the volume includes a chronological log with each entry containing the patient's name, rank, company, regiment, brigade, post office, state, number of days in the hospital, disease, where reported, remarks, usually furlough information, and a hospital number. The second part of the volume consists of a registry, and it contains the same type of information as the log, but lists patients with more serious wounds or illnesses. And then the final section contains information on Madison residents treated at the hospital. So this collection is not restricted to just members of the military. This is a great example of why it's important to take the time to understand each collection, because at first glance, you might write this collection off as only being relevant to those researching Confederate soldiers, considering the title, Mays Confederate Hospital. But if you had ancestors living in Madison, Georgia during this time, they too might appear in this book, and it could therefore be relevant to your search after all. Moving on to FamilySearch.org, which currently has 3,000 results when you search their catalog for hospital records. Again, you're going to have a lot to comb through here if you search hospital records this way, so don't forget that you can use any of these filters on the left of the screen to narrow down your search by year or language, just for example. There are some extensive record sets here. Check this one out for the miscellaneous records from the province of Valencia in Spain, where you see that the hospital death records in this collection span from 1512 to 1900, and you can access those here digitally. Just this collection alone has almost 1.5 million images, and before you start browsing those images, remember it's always a good idea to learn about the collection itself. So if we click here on how to use this collection, we'll be directed to this page, and it not only provides more detail, but it also gives you some translation tools if you don't speak Spanish. Here we have the Spanish genealogical word list and the BYU Spanish script tutorial, along with some reading Spanish handwritten record lessons. Another useful site to track down digitized historical hospital records is Cindy's List. As of making this video, it currently has 81 links that you may also find useful under the hospitals, asylums, and sanatoriums category. To find those, you'll click on categories and scroll down here to medical and medicine. From there, you'll click on hospitals, asylums, and sanatoriums, which will bring you here to this page. As you can see, it's in alphabetical order, but you'll have to do some digging from there. There's quite a few indexes available, as you can see. So those are some free options, but you can also find some hospital records with a paid membership on genealogy sites like ancestry.com, MyHeritage, or Find My Past, for example, which oddly enough actually has a more limited amount of hospital records than when compared to the ones that I just showed you. But it's always good to be thorough in your search, so you'll do the same thing as Family Search, where you'll go to their card catalog, you'll search for hospital records there, just like this, and then here's what Ancestry's results currently look like when you do that. And then here's MyHeritage, followed by Find My Past. Overall, you can see that you'll be putting in some digging skills as you mine for this information, but like I said, there's some very valuable information to be found in these records that could really make that digging worth it. Let's take a closer look at some of the records and see what kind of information you might find during your search. So far, I've really only touched on hospital death records, which typically detail information about the deceased patient, including their cause of death, date of death, and sometimes details about their burial or cremation. Now, aside from death records, there are some other possible records that you might locate during your search, such as patient registers, providing a chronological list of patients treated at the hospital, along with basic information such as their name, age, gender, and date of treatment. There's also admission records, which document the admission of patients to the hospital and typically include their name, date of admission, reason for admission, sometimes their address, and other personal details. There are discharge summaries that outline the patient's condition at the time of the discharge, any follow-up care instructions and recommendations for further treatment. Then there are medical records, which contain detailed information about the treatment and care provided to patients, included their diagnosis, treatments, surgeries, medications, and sometimes the names of attending physicians. Let's take a closer look at some of these records. Here we have the UK post-mortem examination and casebooks from 1840 to 1920, where you see the name of the deceased is given, Mary Adams. We see that she was 42 years old and admitted on March 17, 1841 in London, England. Her disease is listed as cirrhosis of uterus. The day she died is given along with the name of the physician that she was under the care of, and then of course beneath that there are the post-mortem examination notes. Next we have an example of a record of inquests from the coroner's records. This record details the date of filing, the name of the coroner, the name of the deceased and their race, nativity, or in other words where they were born, and the cause of death. Sometimes you might not be able to view the record itself, but there's an index of the records that's available, which we saw earlier on Cindy's list, and that's also the case for this record collection on Ancestry for the Ghetto Hospital illness records of 1940 in Poland. You'll see here that the index will provide the name of the deceased, their age at death in 1940, the year that they were born, their disease, their address, nationality, and classification, but you can't view the original record. Only the index is provided here. If you want more information about the original documents, you just scroll down here for the source information and some very helpful information about this particular collection of records. These next records are patient medical records from the Maine Insane Hospital between 1840 and 1910. And these types of records tend to have much more detail, as you can see. These volumes detail personal medical histories that include the patient's name, the date of admission and discharge by hospital staff, removal by family or death, the patient's place of birth, their marital status, diagnosis, and dated entries by the attending physician describing the patient's condition. This particular entry was for a John T. Wallace. He was 54 years old, of Millbridge, Maine. John was a sea captain and married with 6 children. He was struck by lightning and knocked down aboard a ship while at sea about 20 years ago. Then about 2 years after this incident, he was seized with insanity while on a voyage to sea. Following that, he had another 6 attacks. The physician noted that his current attack came on 6 weeks ago and that he was in a violent state of rage most of the time, especially the last week. John had stripped naked, was filthy, and wasn't sleeping. The physician notes that John had never been as violent in any of his previous attacks as he had on this one. The disease is noted as hereditary on his mother's side. She was insane some 20 years before she died. He is a man of good habits, uses tobacco, and has always been a kind man to his family. The next remarks were made on March 11, 1854, saying that John passed a quiet night and appeared calm and composed that morning. His face was dark and swollen from the bruises he received on his way to the asylum, but he was cooperating and taking pills. It's noted for the rest of the month that he regularly and steadily improved since then and was working by the end of the month. The final note made for John was on April 14th, the day that he was discharged and went home with a representative from Cherryfield, a town in Maine. I did notice that Cherryfield was written at the top of this record, but then it was crossed out and Millbridge was written, so it does make you wonder where he was going next, whether he was going to reunite with his family, but as you can see, something like this would be a really valuable piece of evidence for your ancestor because you've got his name here, his age, and therefore his approximate birth date as well, his location, occupation, marital status. You know, he's got 6 kids, and that his mother also suffered from similar attacks. It can be especially difficult to research women who were born before 1850, so just finding this piece of information alone is a rarity. And since this record doesn't name her, or it's not formally attached to her in any way, the only way that you would learn this information is if you were searching these hospital records. And that is an overview of how hospital records can be beneficial in genealogy research. I hope that this video has given you some guidance and ideas on what's available and how to go about locating and obtaining them. I'll continue covering other death records that I mentioned before in my previous video, so if that interests you, then I hope that you'll come back for those as well. Thanks for watching and happy hunting.